Hey guys, Burch here with another tutorial. This time I'm going to be exploring skin texture and highlighting the skin. This is a pretty good reference for that, Walter White. It's a really good photograph. You can see all these kind of lovely little details everywhere. Perfect for doing skin texture. Now, obviously, the first thing you need to think about is picking your colours. Now, I've done a video about picking a palette before. Here's what I've got at the moment. It's very important that you pick the right colours. So before you do anything like this, you actually have to sit there and look at your picture. What colours do I need? Even if you're not sure if you'll need it, still put it into your pot. I use these little jars. Jam jar, actually, yeah. Anyway, so as you can see, there's a whole load of colours here, and I'm going to use them all pretty much. Maybe not, some not quite as much as others. But when you're doing skin texture like this, there's such a varying difference of colour everywhere you look that you definitely need to get a load of colours and really have a good look and pick the right stuff. So I'm going to move straight into drawing now and colouring. If you want to know more about picking colours, have a look at the picking a palette tutorial that I have up. Okay, you can see the rest of the nose, and I've done a bit more of the cheek. You guys can't see that at the moment, but as you can see, this particular reference there's lots of small little tiny details, speckled kind of details all over his nose, over middle-aged man's kind of skin texture. Much more interesting than young skin, because there's just so much more going on. You've got these sort of odd little freckly bits. So at the moment I am over here. Just have a look at the reference. You can see here we've got quite speckly bits. We've got these fine highlights coming in. So I think here we're going to start to use something like, from what it looks like, this colour here. It is a burnt ochre 50% in the luminance range, and you can also use some cinnamon here, Polychromos cinnamon. Away we go. As I said before in some of my other videos, it's quite important to lay down a base as well, because you can blend these pencils and add them on top of each other quite a lot. Here we've already got a nice base laid down. We're adding some of these details in that I can see. Little creases, little dots and freckles here and there. So it's all about having a lot of patience and very slowly adding all these little nooks and crannies in his face. Bryan Cranston's face. We need a bit more base going on, so we just introduce this colour here as a backdrop, because on the reference the general tone of the area is a slightly more yellow skin tone. So because I want a slightly more yellow tone as a base, I like using this burnt ochre 10%. If the base was slightly pinker colour, I would use this, but because we've got quite a yellow area here, I'm using a burnt ochre 10%, which is a slightly yellower light skin tone. And the same will apply with different colour skin as well. You know, certain browns will be more yellow, certain will be like a cooler brown. I will have a darker skin tutorial as well. Funny how the Polychromos ones call it light flesh, and you know, this is apparently dark flesh. You know, I don't know what kind of dark flesh that is, but it's pretty much pink. It's not really dark flesh. You know, whose dark flesh are we talking about? Like some cartoon characters' dark flesh or something. You know, it's, don't worry about if a pencil says flesh or not. What matters is what colours can you see on your reference. What colours can you see? Can you see a blatant dark pink like this? Yeah, no, you can't. So this is mostly irrelevant. I mean, the only reason I use this is sort of a really subtly adding slightly pinkish areas, or areas where it's slightly more red. Like you can see on this nose, there's a few areas that's slightly red, so I might add a tiny bit of this to it. So remember, don't just go by what it says on the pencil. Go by what colour you can see with your eyes and have a look. Your eyes are the most important judge of this. Okay, you need to train them to look at your reference, scribble down a colour, have a look, see if it's the right colour. You need to do this all the time and train your eye up, because there's one thing being able to draw and, you know, get proportions right and get the right textures going, and there's another thing of picking the right colours. Right, let's carry on with this base. Added a little bit of a base here. Okay. Now, I'm going to bring in this cinnamon, start accentuating some of these little textures that we can see here. Some of these little dark bits, slightly freckly bits. Can't quite tell if they're freckles or if it's just the skin. But we've just got to give a good impression of them on the paper. That's what I love about this. I just love recreating textures that I see in a photo but on a piece of paper with pencils. It's really nice making these textures. This is the kind of reference that I love drawing from, because it's got such varying textures all over it. So you can see there's quite a lot of these little freckly bits that I'm adding now. And we're going to add highlights as well, but highlights, you don't need to worry about them straight away, because we're going to use an electric eraser. We can erase back bits that maybe you've not made light enough at the moment. Just try and place these little dots and freckles in areas that you can see on your reference. This has been quite an important colour here. Kind of like a purpley sort of skin tone, dark sort of purpley skin tone. Like a natural purple, almost like a sort of aubergine-y type thing. Really nice. What is it called? Let me tell you guys what it's called in case you're interested in knowing this. It's burnt sienna 50%. I say aubergine for all the Americans out there. That's an eggplant. This is even darker than the cinnamon, so I'm kind of adding extra dark bits now with this. Like so. And if you look here, we've got this shadow that goes underneath the glasses, and this is actually quite an ideal colour for that shadow there. So can you see this is a really kind of very close to that colour. There's not much, you know, I'll probably mix it with something else, something that's slightly more cinnamony as well, but it's very close to this colour. This is why this pencil is really good at this point. And you don't need to be too precise straight away. This is just like, you know, roughly marking out where this shadow's going to be. This is the beauty of coloured pencils if you're using it on Bristol board, because Bristol board is hard and that means it erases very, very well indeed. So you can really, it's quite malleable, you can knock things back, bring things forward. Definitely worth using Bristol board. I mean, I've used rougher papers with a rougher surface. They can take more pencil, but if you want to erase, it gets a little bit tricky after a while. So that's why Bristol board is just absolutely ideal for this kind of thing. And remember, guys, I always say this, but look at your reference, straight back to your paper. You need to keep on doing that. Don't stop. Don't just get absorbed in what you're doing here, because if you get too absorbed in this, you're going to make up stuff off the top of your head here. And the purpose of what we're doing here is that we're using a reference. So you need to be constantly looking at the reference and looking back, looking at the reference and looking back, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. If you're doing life drawing, you'll be doing that non-stop. If you go to a life drawing class, it's the most important thing. The moment you don't, you take your eye off what you're drawing, whether it be a photo reference or a life reference, you're going to stop drawing it and you're going to draw whatever you think it should look like. That's not what you want. Obviously, unless you're doing something where it's not based in realism. Now over here it's even more yellow on my reference. Generally speaking, slightly more of a yellow hue in all the textures and everything in that area. So I'm using this colour to add a base, which is a slightly more yellow, light yellow skin tone type thing. It's brown ochre, it's called, 10%. Brown ochre 10%. So it might look too yellow to start with, but don't worry, because you want a nice base there. You're gonna add on top of it, so it's not gonna look correct straight away. You're gonna have to work at it and mould it and make it look the way you want it to look. So now that we've done that little yellow base, let's have a look here. We're working on this area here. So we've got these little stipply little bits, which we can do with this pencil to start with. And then I think cinnamon's a good one to use here. Bit of cinnamon, maybe a little bit of this. I always forget what it's called. It's burnt ochre, 50%. Quite a dark one, this. The aubergine kind of thing we can put on there. And also, if we look closely, you can see certain bits are light, but they're kind of like a greyish light colour, like a grey light, not a pinky light colour like this. This is quite an important pencil in this situation. A raw umber 10% as well. Let's add a bit of this raw umber in. But I think it needs to actually go quite a bit darker now. We're adding and adding and adding. No taking away just yet. I like to add a lot and then maybe take away what's needed. Sometimes erasing is needed more than other times. In this situation it's just quite a dense load of colour, so we're just going to keep adding colour here in various ways. It's texturizing his skin. So this is how you do, pause. You've got to keep going at it. Start adding the dark bits, looking back. You're looking at it at a very minute scale. You can't just wash over each area if you want to get this sort of skin texture exactly like you see it on the photo. You can't just scribble over it. You've got to really go in, take your time. Take your time with every little bit. That's the way you do it. So we're getting a slightly more textured look here. Get this cinnamon out. This cinnamon isn't as dark as this. They're kind of similar colours, but I find this is a bit darker, really. The Polychromos cinnamon is much lighter, and so as the skin gets lighter, the shadows that are on that skin are also going to get lighter. So you need to think about, you know, everything becoming lighter, not just the skin, but the shadows. And it's nice to lay the foundations of a texture and then add richness to it afterwards by highlighting and tinting, adding the right tint of colours around it as well. So now that I've done this sort of base type thing with a yellowish skin-like tone, and I've added some texture with this cinnamon, now it's about refining these textures. There's a few things you can do. So you've added a base, you've added a little base, and you've added some of the textures in. But you can see here the skin becomes more yellow than over here. And this is sort of like a blushing cheek kind of effect going on here. It's sort of like a reddish tint over what's already there. So for this kind of situation, this sort of pink is ideal because it will add a very subtle tint to that area. So I'm going to do this very lightly, just to add that particular tone to that area. Now don't worry if you lose a bit of detail, because you can always bring it back. And use it lightly on the textured bits as well, because those bits will become slightly pinker too. Laying down a bit of a base again, building up some texture again. Give a little guideline here to where this crease on his cheek is. So you just got to slowly make it take shape. You're never going to make anything appear out of nowhere very quickly. It has to slowly take shape. It's the important part of this, is patient slowness of it all. You can't rush too much. As with everything, especially if you've just started learning, you need to take it slow. Give your mind a chance to understand what's going on and what you need to do to make things look good. Can't do that if you're going 100 miles an hour. Now we're going to add some highlights using my electric eraser. Have a look. Just here, I've got these little tiny little specks. Use an electric eraser. It's a very good way of adding highlights, a more natural way of adding highlights, because you're not adding any paint to the surface. Some people do that, they use gel pens and things like that, but I find using stuff like that, it's not necessarily light fast, and you don't know what something like that is going to do in, let's say, 10 years time. If quite often that kind of thing will turn yellow. So I find using an electric eraser like this is a much safer option to make sure your work has longevity. So we're just slowly taking away. Now it's not that tricky now. We've kind of added the texture. You can see where the highlights are supposed to be, because we've already mapped that out. Now what we're doing is we're refining it, making those highlights even more visible. Because on this picture, that's what the skin texture looks like. Sometimes it might not be required that you use this. It's all about what you see in the picture and how you want to recreate it. So we're adding more and more of these little bits of highlights everywhere. And can you see it slowly bringing that texture out by using the electric eraser? It's very, very useful little tool, that. You don't want it to look too mottled and silly though. You do still want it to look like skin. So quite often after using an electric eraser, I quite often go back with a pencil and soften areas up that don't necessarily have this kind of stark contrast between the highlight and not highlighted. This area is slightly more yellow, and I'm going to soften it up with a light skin tone that's slightly yellower. Just try and remain faithful to the reference. That's the important thing. Don't just go crazy doing some silly texture if it's not there, you know. It's around here, there isn't that much texture, so that's why I'm knocking it back with a bit of this skin tone here. Some of these areas where you do have shadows, some of it's slightly yellower, so then I'm going back in with this skin tone, because this is a slightly yellower skin tone, and I'm adding a slightly yellower hue over those shadows. And we'll add some more shadows. So we just added highlights, and now we're bringing out the shadows again. Might add in some more highlights in a minute. It's a careful balancing game until you feel happy that you've added and taken away what is needed to end up with a result that you're happy with. Slightly freckly little bits I'm going to emphasise here with this. Burnt sienna 10%. Sometimes you can use lighter colours almost like a shadow by pressing harder. So these freckly bits here, they're not dark enough to be this colour, but if I press this colour quite hard, you get a nice shadow out of it. So we're adding some more freckly bits here. And you can see we're slowly building it all up. It's all adding up and adding up. The longer you spend, the more detailed and rich it will get. The slower, more precisely you start it, don't rush into it, the better it will be in the long run. Got to be slow and precise. Have a look at what's going on in your reference. Slowly start building up the textures. We've got to think of the direction the texture's going as well. So this is sort of his cheek here. The skin sort of folds over it like this. This sort of wavy bit. It's almost like where his cheek sticks up here. Most people's cheeks sort of have you have a cheekbone kind of thing going on here, or you have a bit of flesh that sticks out here. I think for his age as well, it probably slightly droopier and sticks out a little bit more. So we've got to look at the reference and see how that's happening, and see the direction that everything's going. Can you see it's all kind of going like this at the moment, and it comes up here and it goes underneath the glasses because the glasses press against the skin slightly. So you got to make sure all the textures are going in the right direction after looking at your reference. If they don't do it in your reference, then don't do it. But you've got to think about these things. You've got to look at your reference and think, what direction are these textures going? You know, what direction do I need to lay down these marks? What colours do they need to be? Do I need to use the highlighter and the electric eraser? And so on. And it's an amalgamation of all these things whizzing around in your mind, constantly whizzing around in your mind. And you're slowly adjusting and adding and adjusting. That's how you get a good result with this kind of drawing. Let your mind just constantly think about what's going on, what I need to add next. And eventually you'll start doing it naturally. You know, you won't have to really sit down and think too much. You just start doing it. It's like riding a bike or something like that. I recently passed my driving test, and yeah, wow, it was a bit weird driving around. But you know, like anything, it's takes time to make it second nature. And to start with, you need to actually think, what am I doing? You know, which is the stage I'm at with driving. I have to constantly, you know, review what I'm doing, make sure, you know, I'm being safe and looking at the signs and stuff. So, you know, yeah, you've got to keep your eyes peeled, much like you'd have to if you just started driving. You've got to keep your eyes peeled. You've got to keep your eyes on your reference. What am I doing here? What's coming up? You know? It's a lot less stressful than driving, though. You know, hardly anything goes wrong with drawing. You can just have a bit of fun, and if it goes wrong, you can erase stuff. This is a slightly darker alternative to the cinnamon, I'd say. So there's the cinnamon. Here is the what is this again? It's a Venetian Red, I think. Really useful. Venetian Red. You got an area where you've used cinnamon and there's bits in it that are sort of darker. Venetian Red's a good way to go. And the thing with this is it's nice to not press too hard. You can emphasize these tiny little bits that are slightly darker. You know, we're kind of going for these little freckly things here. This adds a bit of texture. You know, I've done it here on the nose as well, added a few little bits of darkness from this. It's really useful to darken areas that you've used cinnamon on. And even under these glasses here, it's, you know, it adds that little red hue that is missing from that burnt sienna for the shadow under the glasses. But this shadow is probably going to get even darker whilst I'm doing the glasses. For this tutorial, I used a bit of dark flesh to sort of add very gentle bits of reddish tint to his cheek, which I'm still going to be using probably, adding little bits of reddishness here and there. Very lightly used that one. Just used the Venetian Red here to add little bits of texture, because this is probably one of the darkest pencils I've used in this area. It's nice to crack open and get a nice dark pencil to add all those little dark bits. Even if they're very tiny and very subtle, it's good to have one ready. But you've got to make sure it's relevant, okay? So this is really dark for this area, this pencil here. Really dark. I'm calling this really dark. Whereas if you just looked at it, not in context, you'd think, well, is that really dark? Well, yeah, it is. In this context, it really is. It's very, very dark. It's a very dark pencil for the area that we're doing. If I were to just do that, it would look ridiculous. So this is probably one of the darker pencils I've used. Then we've got the trusty cinnamon, which is wonderful. When you think that there are many different types of colours of flesh, you know, this cinnamon can be used across the board, I'd say. You know, this could be used on black skin, on Asian skin, any kind of skin. This is quite an important colour, really. It's like a nice medium. See, I think if you're doing a darker skin, if you're doing black skin, this is almost like a good base. This makes a great base for black skin. This is a good one to go by as well. But remember, you gotta just look at your reference and work out what colours are relevant. We've used the brown ochre 10% and the burnt ochre 10% to sort of lay a base down. Then we used this burnt ochre 50% as a sort of extra dark cinnamon in a way. It's similar to the Venetian. Very similar indeed. Oh, sorry, that's cinnamon. Oh. The Venetian is darker and richer and more red. This is slightly more in line with skin tone. So this is kind of, you know, it's like a gradient really. If we look here, even this is why you can't really go by the the color of the pencils themselves. You've got to use them on a piece of paper. Let's say this is the lightest one. You can see that. Then we've used, after that, to add some textures in lightly, we use this cinnamon. After that, to add even more depth and sort of over here where it's dark anyway, this is the next one. So this is slightly darker. This is the burnt ochre 50%. Then after the burnt ochre 50%, this has got the Venetian Red, the Polychromos. It's even darker there, and we could just go on and on and on. I mean, we've got, what we've got here. This is an Indian Red. After the Venetian, look, it's even darker than the Venetian. You know, but then there's also colours in between that I haven't talked about. You know, like this one is the Pomeranian Red, which is a slightly redder version of the Venetian. You know, so it's really about picking the right colours and knowing the gradients of colour and what point you're at. You know, have I done my light base? Am I adding textures now? I'll map it out with a slightly darker colour, and then you add more and more. And obviously you take away, like I have, to create the highlights. Hope you guys have a great time drawing, and I will see you next time with some tips and techniques. Cheers guys, see you later.